So welcome to St. Sarah's Parish of the Apostolic Johannite Church. My name is Father Donald Donato, and I'm going to be talking about the second part of our series, Tasting the Divine, the Gnosis of the Mass. And I wanted to start off, we are talking about not just the Eucharist itself, but the meaning of the Mass, the elements, what happens, why we do it, from a Johannite point of view, or at least from my point of view, in our experience as a Johannite parish. I wanted to start off with a quote from St. Augustine. "Late I have loved beauty so old and so new. Late have I loved you. And see, you were within, and I was in the external world, and sought you there. And in my unlovely state, I plunged into those lovely created things which you made. You were with me, and I was not with you. The lovely things kept me far from you, though if they did not have their existence in you, they had no existence at all. You called and cried out loud and shattered my deafness. You were radiant and resplendent. You put to flight my blindness. You were fragrant, and I drew in my breath, and now I pant after you. I tasted you, and I feel but hunger and thirst for you. You touched me, and I am set on fire to attain the peace which is yours." That is where I got the idea for the name of this series. He said, "I tasted you, and I feel but hunger and thirst for you." So the idea of consuming things as part of a ritual act is not only a Christian phenomenon. It's something that existed, for example, in the context of early Christianity among the Greeks, and of course all over the Roman Empire. There were Greek cults of various sorts. But even in the Bible, in Genesis we know, Melchizedek, who was what was called the priest king of Salem or Jerusalem, he was a person who was seen to be more important and set aside from the priesthood of Aaron, somebody who was so important that he was chosen to give basically the Eucharist, bread and wine, which is very unusual in Judaism, or pre-Judaism, to Abraham. So way back at the very beginning, the first patriarch. So the idea of bread and wine as a means, as a compositio loci, or as a thing that we focus on to be the spiritual reality in the moment, is something that is not just Greek, it's not pagan, it's not exclusively from the Judaic side of the world. It's something that has come through all of them, something that became extremely important to us, the consumption of the divine. But in order to get to the point where we're ready to do that, over the centuries we've developed various spiritual technologies in order to be able to prepare ourselves to enter into that different place. It is out of space and time, we say that at the beginning. Now, I wanted to talk about the Mass in general, not just the Johannite Mass. What I'm saying usually is in general, so any Catholic Mass is pretty much the same. We have the same elements. So the first half, you could say, is the liturgy of the Word, and that's where we read. There are a number of things that happen before that I'll explain in just a second, but we're in a phase of preparation, and we're sort of thinking about and being inspired by teachings that came before us. So obviously, if you lived in a time when there were no teachings of Christianity, you had to look for other things. So that's why we have you know, especially in the mainstream churches, the Anglican to the Episcopal Church, or in the Roman Catholic Church, you'll see a lot of use of the Old Testament in the first reading. Psalms, the second. We do two readings. One is the, you know, is just usually it's not a gospel, and the second one would be a gospel, or a very important source of inspiration. In the Johannite Church, we take no scripture literally. So, gospel is just something that is considered to be, or agreed upon by the community that created it to be very important. So it should always be taken in that context. But anyway, the beginning of the Mass is sort of, if you've ever been involved with music, sort of a warm-up session. You know, you're trying to get the juices flowing and focusing on something outside of yourself. And that's really the most important thing, isn't it? So the second part of the liturgy is the liturgy of the Eucharist. I will not be talking about that tonight because there's an enormous amount of material to cover between the very beginning and the end of the profession, the prayers. It's really not, it's actually very different than, I don't mean to poo-poo anybody's religion, but there is a fundamental difference between the Mass and just going to church in a Protestant church. That's a sort of a big division, because for those of us who at least share real presence, that is, the host actually is divine, it's different. It's just a different thing. And that's why Congregationalists and Unitarians and, not that they're Protestants, but they used to be, you know, there are different, the Baptists and so forth. So they don't have real presence as a part of their theology. So they don't need a priesthood. That's why some denominations have a priesthood with an episcopacy, the bishops who have their lineages from the apostles, and some have ministers. The Protestants have ministers because there is no sacrifice going on. The action of the or aiding the transformation, that process requires a priest. So that's why Melchizedek is so important. That's why I keep mentioning his name, because Christ was called a priest in of the order of Melchizedek, as are we. So the tradition wasn't that of Aaron, it was Melchizedek. It's a very important thing, so it's a very ancient tradition, and we'll get into the reasons why it's important. But in order to make a true sacrifice, we have to have four things. A sacrificial gift, bread and wine. A sacrificing person, minister, the priest, or bishop. A sacrificial action, the words of institution, the consecration. And a sacrificial end or object, which is the real presence and the gifts. So that's normally part of the Eucharist part of this discussion, but I just wanted to explain to you why we have a priesthood and why we're even talking about this in the first place. So the rites that precede, so that come before the liturgy of the Word, in our version anyway, are the entrance, the greeting, the penitential rite, the Kyrie, the Gloria, and the collect, which is when I give a prayer. So they have a character of a beginning, an introduction, a preparation. So you come in and you get ready and you're thinking about what you're supposed to be doing. And I'd say that we probably engage in these elements first to empty our minds, which is what we say, of external worries and thoughts, and unite as one sacred community to listen to the Word, and then prepare ourselves to take to communion, to become one with the divine. So, in the Johannite tradition, we call that the Johannite divine liturgy, the Grail of undefiled wisdom. And so, this first thing, it does not appear in a regular Catholic mass of any rite. And that's the one that probably everybody knows is very different, the archangelic invocation, otherwise known as calling the quarters. Now, the funny thing about calling the quarters is that some people who have any past in the Wiccan tradition, as a neo-pagan, or any of these kind of Enochian things too, I think that they use it, they think, oh, this is a kind of a witchy thing to do. This is something that's, a pagan thing to do. Well, actually, it predates Wicca by quite a long time. Wiccans came out of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and
There's worms in here.
or Solis predate them. There were people in England, I don't know, some people say that it was in the 30s, but it wasn't until the 1960s that Wicca became at all well known in the United States. Anyway, calling the quarters is much older than that. It's Hermetic, so it's very old. It's very old indeed. And part of our church came out of the Hermetic tradition, and we have readings from the Hermetica in some of our liturgies. So it's a very Greek thing. It's a very, also the Neoplatonists used it. The 4 cardinal directions. Also the colors. But you see, it's a very important imagery also from a Christian point of view, because it gives you the image of the cross, the equal-armed cross, which is the symbol of the spiritual and the material coming together. So it's a very important part of what we do. We begin, many times we share space, as you know, in the church with other religions or with another denomination. We don't have a relic under the altar. This is a way of sort of consecrating the space, making sure it's safe, and asking for the corresponding archangels of each of the elements to help us. We ask them literally to help us and to watch over what we're doing. So the correspondences, the spiritual correspondences, are very important, because you are truly spiritual, but you're also truly material, and material stuff comes from spiritual stuff. So your corresponding elements are very important. You are all of those things. So in the preparation, we've added that as a kind of, what would you call it? It's definitely a preparation and a way of connecting yourself, in a way, to spiritual beings that correspond with everything that's real about you. So, that's the first part. The second is the asperges, which is not asparagus. Asperges is a word which just means the sprinkling of holy water. And in ancient tradition, obviously, purifying people with water, including baptism, was very important. It's a preparation for the real presence, definitely, along with sensing. It's been used in the church since at least the 10th century, so the 900s, but most of these early documents, as I was explaining earlier today, just because it was mentioned the first time, it means that we have a document which says that they did it, but sometimes things happen, or almost always things happen, long before they wrote them down. So it's quite possible that it was before it was certainly a custom in early antiquity, and it was usually done on either the vigil mass, like we do on a Saturday night, or on a Sunday, at a Sunday mass. The third element is the censing, where you see the priests. In a larger church you probably wouldn't see this, but you see me often first blessing the creature of earth, the incense that's cast onto the fire. We cense around I usually swing 3 times for the Trinity. Most people do, some people just go in a circle. And you try to, using frankincense of course, which is sometimes mixed with myrrh or other things, other spices, and scents, resins, reminiscent of the 3 kings, the gifts, frankincense, gold, and myrrh. So it definitely has a Christian reference, but it's been used, for millennia by others. Frankincense in particular has been seen to have spiritual correspondences to cleansing. And it comes from the sap of a tree. I don't know if you know that, but it comes from resin that's created from the sap of a tree. That's a very unusual tree, and there are very few places in the world that can grow them. One being in Yemen, I believe, in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. And so it's quite possible that the use of frankincense was probably something that was introduced into Judea by the Queen of Sheba on one of her visits to see her boyfriend Solomon. And that's probably how it made it into our culture. So after the censing, we have the penitential rite. This is something which is common to all apostolic liturgies. The penitential rite is, for us anyway, is an act as a community. We remember our errors and realize that we are forgiven, we're in a state of grace. But we also agree with ourselves and with the divine to correct our errors, to take responsibility for them. It's not good enough to just say, "Oh, I'm free of sin." Errors are errors. They're something that we have to take on by ourselves. But the important thing to remember is that your worthiness is not in question. You're always worthy to take, so long as you realize that you make errors. But it's very important to do that. It's, I think, actually extremely important. It's something that I don't think you can have one without the other. You can't have a true communion with the divine without recognizing your errors. And it's true of how we think of ourselves, our higher mind, when we think about what we do, how we do things, and how we could do them better. It's always sort of a battle to know yourself, to work on the things that you know are weaknesses, and to negotiate with them, and to try to make your weaknesses into strengths. But you can't expect to reach a very high level of spiritual awareness or connection with God unless you're willing to have the impurities burned off. You've got to do that. I mean, however you want to characterize it, however you want to phrase it, it's really very much up to you, as long as you're honest about it. That's why in the Johannite Church we have very few moral regulations, but one of them is no deceit. If you're deceiving, if you're living in deceit, you're harming other people. How you live your life is up to you, but if you're harming other people in what you do, how can that be sort of appropriate when you're talking about communing with the divine. A being that works entirely off of love. Something that's so unimaginable for the human mind to understand, that there would be a force that does nothing but give of itself. How is it appropriate for you to approach that if you don't recognize at least that you have some shortcomings that you need to work on? I don't think it should be taken much further than that, because you go the other way. You know, you swing into the guilt and atonement theology, where mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, which is fine as long as you understand that what you do to yourself psychologically and spiritually, you have to take responsibility for it. And you can't serve other people if you abuse yourself. So, the penitential rite, I think, is very, very important to prepare for that kind of meeting. So then, as a community, you join me in singing the Kyrie, which is just Greek, which means, Kyrie eleison, which means Lord have mercy, Christe eleison, Christ have mercy. True of every apostolic denomination. It's a punctuation mark. It's a, full stop on the penitential rite. We together say, please, sorry that we act like monkeys more often than not, and that's not cool. We understand we understand that we do that, and we also understand that we don't have all the responsibility, but there are people who've been able to raise above being a monkey. So we must be able to do that too. Amen. So then we enter into a different section, which changes with every day, which is the collect, the prayer, the communal prayer, where I usually mention the name of the saint whose feast it is, or whatever high holiday it might be, or the season of the church that we're celebrating. Usually during that prayer, I will begin by saying, thank you for this person and what they did, and say something about some of the things that we find inspirational in them. Please let us be cool like them. And it changes every day with either the intention of the Mass or the person. Like, if I'm going too fast, just let me know. I'll open it up for questions as soon as I get through the elements. Is that all right? Okay, so then for us we have the institutional narrative. On high holidays of the Apostolic Johannite Church, we remember our heritage by reciting the centuries-old institutional narrative. This is unique to the Johannite Church, reflecting the apostolic nature of our communion through the esoteric lineage of St. John. In its current form, with some minor revisions, the narrative is at least 2 centuries old, dating from the Mass of Dr. Bernard Raymond Fabre-Calaprat, the Sovereign Pontiff and Patriarch of the Johannite Church in France. Then after, it's very important. I would say actually the litany is probably, in my mind anyway, yes?
There's actually some interesting conversation, excuse me, happening on the AJC Facebook page right now about the institutional narrative. Have you seen any of that? Anybody?
Yeah.
One of our priests out in Vancouver posted about how he doesn't believe that the narrative is literally true, but the story is important, and he says it much better than I do, of course, but it's interesting. So if you have a chance to look at that on the AJC Facebook page.
Yeah. Well, again, I think I don't think it's particularly important, to be honest with you, if it's true or not. The what's important, I think, is first of all the affiliation of John, which is extremely important, and the existence of the ancient community of John in Asia Minor, which is where we draw a lot of our experience. And those of us who've been through our theological studies know that that sort of ancient and primitive Johannine community in Asia Minor is very inspirational, very open, but also characterized by huge differences of opinion. And it's also something that Fabre Palaprat allowed. He was very open to differences of opinion, so long as he had very big pants. And he was a rather formal person, a medical doctor, but also a priest. He was consecrated. He became a Roman Catholic priest. He went to seminary, and there is some evidence to suggest that he was actually consecrated before we originally thought. At any rate, his colleagues were Roman Catholic bishops, constitutional bishops. So the existence of, or the Johannite lore of before him came from his affiliation with Freemasonry, the Order of the Temple. And it's possible that, I'm sure actually, I know for a fact that a lot of the information that he had, he didn't make up, he got it from people from before him, probably from the late 1600s. If you're interested in that, you can go on the Johannite channel on YouTube and pull up my lecture about the Leviticon that I gave last year in Chicago. I gave a little bit of background about that group. It was called the Petit Rassemblement des Templiers, which was a Johannite group that was patronized by the French monarchy during the time of the regency of Louis the 15th, I believe. So anyway, but that's another story. So yeah, moving back to the idea, however, of both the institutional narrative, which begins with Moses and talks about Jesus and how it goes on to the Templars and all this stuff, that leads into the next element, which is the litany of the sovereign pontiffs, or the Johannite popes, you could say, each leader of the Johannite community over the years. And that is something that's a list actually it's much older than Fabre Palaprat's church, so it's older than a couple of 100 years old. And it's important for a number of reasons. It's important to remember, first of all, that the current AJC is in apostolic succession, but it has almost all of, if not all of, the valid lines of succession from the apostles. So it's no longer just the affiliation of John. It's also all the others. So the Orthodox, the Petrine. Not that I think that's absolutely important, but I think it says something about the serious nature of the church and the fact that we're much different than we used to be in terms of openness. And but there's a spiritual side to this, which I think is much more important, which is the chain of human beings that goes from then until now. And that's the real power that comes to the Mass. Why are we invoking the names of all these people? Not just Fabre Palaprat, but we name a whole bunch of people. Giordano Bruno, and Mary Magdalene, and the Apostles. All these people are linked to us. And through apostolic succession, you have people who lay hands on them, the next generation, the next generation. So there is a spiritual bond. That's very important, because there's nothing more important than people. We are like the little shards of God walking around. We are the people that we are the thing that we're supposed to take care of. And living or dead, those people are helping you, or part of your chain. They're part of a very important, it might be subtle for some people, but it changes the nature of the Mass. You're remembering, a historical context in which you are a very small part. I am a tiny little chain, link in a chain that's that old. And it's very powerful when you think about it. And it really puts a fine point on how we treat people, how important every single person is. We can't be full. There can be no fullness. The pleroma that they talk about in Gnosticism can't happen without everybody. Everyone at the end is rejoined. So that's a little bit about the litany, the institutional narrative of the litany. So then, you actually formally begin the liturgy of the Word, where you have the first reading, and I think I already described that. We usually choose, there's some either Old Testament scripture or a Gnostic gospel or other kinds of writing. There, even in our lectionary, we have things from Yule and selections from Mani, and people who are inspirational, have something to say, which is an interesting juxtaposition to the gospel and to the feast, to the intention of that day. It's a very interesting job of providing some contrast between the reading and the gospel that still has to do with the same subject. So in the future, when you go to Mass, listen very carefully, and you'll hear that the readings have been chosen very carefully. And oftentimes they sound almost contradictory, unless you think about it for a very long time. So after that, we all sing the Alleluia, and in a larger church setting, there would be a procession with candles and incense, and the deacon, there would be acolytes who would go with the deacon or the priest to the lectern to read the gospel. And as you know what happens. But it's treated with great reverence, because these are documents which represent sort of like a consensus of a community over a very long period of time. It might have been just one point of view. It might be a conflicting point of view from another group. So the Johannites versus the people who were with Philip, or the people who were with Andrew, or whatever, Peter. But there's no reason not to study and to reflect on all of them. In fact, there's every reason to study and reflect on all of them, because it's a different kind of gnosis from each group, a different experience in each individual and each community, school. So that's the gospel. Then, of course, the homily. Here again, there's a big difference between a homily and a sermon, and that's one of my pet peeves that I want to get out now. A sermon is a Protestant beast that is usually very long and very often ends in fundraising.
Yeah.
A homily is a reflection that I like to keep elegant and short, where you talk about the readings, the intention for the day, or the saint, the feast, the season of the church, and then most importantly, how it affects the parish, the people. So if there was a flood, or if I wouldn't want to go without mentioning, without tying it in somehow into that. It's not an art, I don't think it's an art form. A lot of priests give horrible homilies. It should be short, I think, and to the point. Something that, where I can finally, in prose, since we are creatures of prose and not only ritual, say something to you. And that would have been, in the old days, the most that you would ever hear from me. So, it is very different from a sermon. And I'm sure that you're all very happy about that. We don't have 2-hour-long homilies. So then, that brings us to the profession. In Catholic and other mainstream apostolic churches, the profession is a detailed account of beliefs, or we call them creeds. The creeds are introduced to the Roman form of the Mass and to other rites as a means of filtering out adherents of various so-called heresies over a period of probably more than 500 years. We do have a statement of principles as a church, but beyond that, and the principle of lex orandi, lex credendi, which I already explained, which is what we pray is what we believe, the HAC does not require a subscription to any creed. The statement of principles is why you come to us. If you don't want to play by those rules, then it's not the church for you. I mean, it's not completely pie in the sky. You can't just make stuff up as you go along. It is a tradition. We have a way of doing things. We also have freedom of conscience and of what you believe literally to be true. But the statement of principles is a pretty general statement. I highly recommend that you look at it over and over and over again, because it's a very well-crafted statement that can be interpreted very, very broadly or very specifically. I can say that I've learned over the years that there is actually nothing that really stands between me and people who you might consider to be very much more conservative than we are in the Catholic world. Absolutely no theological problem whatsoever, because that's the way I interpret it. That's probably not the way they interpret it, but that's their problem. So we don't require we don't require that you believe in any creed. And in lieu of separating the seekers who have come to commune with each other as the body of the incarnate Christos, our church extends a helping hand by publicly recollecting the struggle that we all face in our quest for holy Gnosis. We do this by reciting the Excerpta ex Theodoto, which ironically was chronicled by Clement of Alexandria, who was not exactly favorable, but still. And that's when you know that if you've been to a Johannite Mass, you've seen us go in front of the altar after I give my homily, and we kneel, and we say what makes us free is the Gnosis of who we were, of what we have become, of where we were, of wherein we have been cast, of where to we speed, of wherefrom we are redeemed, of what birth truly is, and of what rebirth truly is. Theodotus was a theologian, a follower of Valentinus, who were celebrating on the 14th. Valentine. He was, of course, a priest and a bishop. At the time, there was no difference. It was before the split between the presbyterate and the episcopacy. He was up for election as Bishop of Rome, which means he would have been in charge of the Roman papacy, even though he was a Gnostic. So that shows you how heterodox the community was. He didn't win, unfortunately. But anyway, that's that's the milieu that he's coming out of. They notice, so we're talking the year 100 to 160, that era, very early. So after the profession, the general intercessions, these are prayers that are set in general for the good of humanity. We pray for the leadership of the country and of our communities, the living and the dead, saints and sinners, you name it. Everybody's included. It's also a time for us to recall our needs, and oftentimes people will bring me lists of people that they would like me to mention, because as we prepare for this act of union with the divine, we're all together and we make it more potent. No question about it. Your prayers are important, and together prayers are much more potent than singular. So we sort of a time for us to remember things and people who are in need and in distress. It's for that reason it's really important for you to, if you're a regular parishioner, congregant, another, even if you're in another church, to make sure that your intentions, that you're thinking about what you're doing. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's really important, because ritual is all about intention. It's not. It can be. I could be just a monkey dressed up in a dress, waving stuff around the room, or I could be my spiritual being, calling down things and actually doing something. Because I'm in the moment, because I'm not just mouthing the words, I'm thinking about it. The intention is everything. So, I'm very much more in favor of the sort of, I'm certainly not a hand waver, but, that kind of charismatic feeling with no snakes. But feeling the Spirit is very important. No snakes. You don't have to prove it by swallowing fire or walking on glass or any of these things. You're more than welcome to do that at home with the help of a professional. But here, it would be just really great if, when we're going through the different elements of the Mass, you realize how important each one is.